Hi, SUSECON. Welcome to our session, SQL Server and SLES, which is production ready. James and I are excited to talk to you about this session. And what we're going to talk to you about this session is how you can have your SQL Server run on SLES, which is production ready. And this is going to be a fast-paced session with a lot of demos and a lot of scripts that we are kind of going to show. And please don't be worried, because all of this is linked and very well documented in the slide under the references section. So you can actually go ahead and take a look at that. So with that said, let's just start rolling. But before that, let me just go ahead and take a couple of minutes to introduce the speakers, which is us. So James, over to you.
Thanks, Amit. Hi, SUSECON. So I'm James Yang, Solutions Architect at SUSE, and I'm primarily focused on working with Microsoft as a partner. And one of the things that that we would like to work on is SQL Server. So over to you, Amit.
Thanks, James. Hi, everybody. My name is Amit Khandelwal. I'm a senior program manager with SQL Server and Linux and SQL Server Containers, working with Microsoft. And if you have any questions regarding how you can run SQL Server in your environments on Linux or on containers, you can see my social handle as well as my email address. Would be more than happy to get questions and if I can be of any help there. So with that said, I think it's time for us to quickly talk about the agenda. So let me just run down the agenda here. The first thing that we're going to talk about is the SQL Server Linux and its journey, how we started in 2017 and where we are today. Then we are going to go ahead and deep dive and understand how you can automate and how you can deploy SQL Server on SLES in a way which is ready for production, which is configured, and which can be scalable when you want to do multiple deployments in your environment. So that is something that we're going to talk about. And then what we are really excited to talk about is SQL Server Containers, how you can run SQL Server container images on SLES, and how you can actually deploy this in a Kubernetes environment, and how you can basically go ahead and, because SQL Server is a stateful application, how you can actually deploy SQL Server as a stateful set, and how we can get started with that. And then the most important feature that I've always, I've seen the demand for is the ADU authentication, how you can enable Active Directory authentication for SQL Server, which is running on Linux, be it on SLES, be it as a SQL container image. That is something that we're going to talk as well as show you a demo of. And then we end this session by quickly looking at what's going to come up very soon and what is there in our pipelines. So that is where we end. And of course, if time permits, we would love to take questions during the session as well. Awesome. With that said, let's get started. So the SQL Server journey. So let me be quick about this, because I just want to let you know that the first release of SQL Server on Linux and SQL Server Container was in 2017, year 2017. And the next 2 years, what we have done is we've closed down the parity, or we have closed down the feature gaps that were there between SQL Server on Windows versus SQL Server on Linux. And we've also ensured that any feature that you have on SQL Server on Linux is also available on SQL Server Containers, which are Linux-based. So today we are at about 96–97% parity in terms of features between SQL Server on Windows and SQL Server on Linux. With that said, our focus on container images also remains pretty much accurate and very aggressive, wherein not only we have created the container images, but we've also built solutions on top of those container images. One such example is big data clusters, which was released in SQL in the year 2019 with SQL 2019. The other feature that is currently in preview is the Azure Arc Data Services, where you can basically go ahead and run SQL Server container images on hybrid environments, which can be an environments collection of both on-premises as well as cloud. So those that has been the journey. What I really want to focus on is this slide. So I'll just give a pause for like a second or two, just for you to see how many options you have to deploy SQL Server 2019 in your environments. Yeah. So as you can see from that slide, you can deploy SQL Server pretty much on any environment of your choice, be it on cloud, be it on-prem, or any distribution of your choice, be it Windows, be it Linux. In Linux, it could be on SLES, it could be on other distributions. And then if you're basically deciding to go with SQL Server Containers, there also you can basically go ahead and take a choice if you want to go ahead and install an opinionated Kubernetes clusters like Rancher, or you want to go ahead and do it as a standalone container images on a VM, you could actually go ahead and do that as well. And any environment could be an exclusive on-premises, could be a mix of both, or just could be something on cloud like Azure Kubernetes Service. You could actually go ahead and do that as well. With that said, with so many options available for deployment, now let's focus on SQL Server and SLES and how you can automate the deployments. And for this, I'd like to call James to take us through.
Thanks, Amit. Yeah, so the journey, like I mentioned, has been exciting pretty, so far. So yeah, that's been great. And thanks for explaining some of those options. So yes, I just want to talk about some of the kind of automation options you have with SQL Server. One is with Azure VMs, right? So Azure is, really, really popular, one of the top cloud solution providers right now. And there we have worked with Microsoft to produce an image with SLES, SQL Server on SLES, I guess. We kind of provided the base images, and the Microsoft team has taken the image, installed SQL Server, done some configuration, and published it to the Azure Marketplace as a prepackaged solution. So, what's really cool about this is that, everything's kind of ready for you. You don't need to launch a VM and then install SQL Server and, worry about if things are going to work after that. So everything's already ready for you to go, and you just pay for it hourly, right? So that's that's really how one of the tenets of cloud, right? So use as much as you want and then pay for it as you go. So that's one option for you. Another is Terraform. So Terraform has been quickly become the de facto solution to deploy to the cloud. So you kind of declare the infrastructure that you want in their language, and then deploy it to cloud, and you're ready to go. So and you can kind of compose an architecture that you want and include the SQL Server on VMs, and then deploy this to actually multiple cloud providers, and also on-prem with vSphere and things like that. And as SUSE, we've actually done some work with Libvirt as well. So if that's something you're interested in, that's also an option for you. One of the deployment options I mentioned was Kubernetes. So Helm charts is kind of a way you can think of it as a package manager for or npm for something from Node.js, right? So you take this, also declare in YAML as well, and then deploy it to your Kubernetes cluster of choice, right? And there's kind of two main ways, two domain objects from Kubernetes that you can kind of do this with. One is with stateful sets, and the other is with deployments. And Amit's going to actually do a quick demo for the stateful set.
Yep.
And so here is the listing from the Azure Marketplace that I kind of mentioned. This is SQL Server 2019 on SLES 12 SP5. And to find this, you just head over to the Azure Marketplace and do a search for SLES Linux, and this is the image that's going to show up. There will be actually a link to this in the references later on that you can take to use as well. And also want to mention that this is an exclusive offering on the Azure Marketplace as well, so it's not available anywhere else. So it's pretty special. Okay, so yeah, let's just get to the fun stuff. Right? Let's just cut over to the demo of Terraform. Okay, so I'm going to get started right away. We don't have a lot of time for this session. Just going to start this off with a Terraform apply. I've already created my Terraform templates here in the HashiCorp language, and I also have a Azure account ready with a subscription that we're going to be deploying to. And I'm already logged in locally with the AZ CLI using the AZ login command, so that my local machine is authenticated to create Azure resources. So it looks like Terraform has come back with a plan of what it's going to do. It's going to create 11 resources here. Nothing to change, nothing to destroy. So I'm going to go with yes. If there were already resources and are deployed in Azure already, here we would see some resources to change in place if it's possible. And if we were actually tearing it down, this would appear here. So it looks like the resource creation has started. It's creating resource group, network security group, application security group, security rules, some subnets, and also our compute resource here, a virtual machine scale set for SQL Server. So while this is running, I wanted to, it's going to take a couple of minutes, so I'm going to show a diagram here of what we're actually deploying so you can kind of visually see it. So this is the resource group that's created, that's going to contain all our resources, and then within the resource group we're going to create a virtual network. This is so we'll get like a private network to work with, as well as 2 subnets. I'll talk about this one in a second, but this first one is going to contain our SQL Server instance, and also a security group that's attached to the network interface of SQL Server so that we can control access to it. SQL Server by default listens on 1433, and pretty much we pretty much don't need anything else in order to connect to it besides maybe SSH to the machine. So port 22 for that. So just those 2 should be sufficient for what we're doing here. In addition, we'll be attaching a public IP to the network interface as well, so that we can connect to the SQL Server instance from my machine to Azure. So this is what we're deploying here. I also wanted to show an alternate deployment, an alternate architecture, is using this other subnet to create a jump box here, or what we call like a bastion. And so instead of having the public IP attached to the network interface of SQL Server, of the SQL Server virtual machine, we'll instead attach it to the virtual machine of the bastion or the jump box. So this allows SQL Server to be deployed without a public IP and just using a private IP. And if we need to get to the SQL Server instance, we'll go through the jump box. We'll first SSH into the jump box, and then maybe run some queries against the SQL Server there. This is generally a best practice. You don't want your database to be exposed to the internet, having a public IP when you really don't need to. Typically, a application would be running in another subnet or here that would connect to the SQL Server instance. So it doesn't really need a public IP. So this is generally a best practice for security and pretty common in production scenarios. But for the purposes of this demo, we'll just stick to this for ease of use. So it looks like the deployment has finished here. And one of the final steps in the deployment was to essentially output a file containing the host name of the SQL Server virtual machine. So that's this SQL Server YAML. Let's just take a quick look at that. So it's just a single line with the FQDN as a key and then the value of the host name. So I'm just going to copy this. Since the instance takes a little bit of time to come up, and SQL Server itself to start in the virtual machine, we want to check to see if it's actually listening on the port before we actually try connecting to it. So I'm just going to write a small bash script here to check to see if the port is actually open yet, or if the SQL Server is actually listening yet. So we'll do this with netcat. So while true, we'll use netcat to connect to the SQL Server instance on port 1433, and then we'll sleep for 1 second and continue forever. Okay, so it looks like it's kind of thing will give us some time to essentially settle here. It might stop listening on the port on this port for a second, so just give it some time to settle. But one of the main reasons we want to wait for this is, for it to make sure that it's listening, and also to set our own password. So when this image, this image that comes with SQL Server essentially sets SQL Server with its own password, a default password that we may not know what it is. So we want to set our own here, and that was one of the configuration that we used to provide to Terraform. And this is just a simple JSON-like interface to configure our Terraform templates. and the password was one of them. So essentially it would stop the instance, set the password, and then restart the instance back up. Some other configuration here is the instance size. Here it's standard B4MS with a single instance. And then some other configuration here for the OS. So the name of the user that we use to SH to the machine. So the username of the operating system. In this case, this is the SLES OS here, as well as a pointer to the public key that's used to SH to it. This is actually dropped into the authorized users file, so we can SH to it. Jump box here is for configuring the jump box, like I mentioned here. We're not doing this, so false is fine. The region where we're deploying to, which is West US2, as well as some user-defined key value pairs, like our environment. This is just for if we want to query our resources, but essentially these are attached to tags of the resources created. So it looks like it's listening, it's kind of settled down now, so we should be able to connect to it. Just gonna stop this. And I've installed the SQL Server extension here for VS Code, and we should be able to use this to connect to SQL Server. It's pretty nifty because everything's already integrated in the IDE here. So let me just copy the host name here and set up a new connection. So the host name, database name is, we don't need to put anything here. We're going to use SQL login to connect to it as the SA user. Also the password here. So let's copy this, paste this here. Yes, I want to save the password. I don't need a name right now, so the default is fine. Okay, it looks like it's created and connected, and it's showing up here. So it looks like the deployment went successful. You can see the default databases here and other things that I just created. So this concludes the demo.
Wonderful. Thank you for that demo with Terraform, James. All right, now let's get to SQL Server Containers and talk about how you can basically start running SQL Server on SLES images. So the first thing is, unfortunately, right now, we do not have a pre-built image available where you have the SQL Server running on SLES-based OS image, but that doesn't mean that this is not supported. You can create a custom container which is built on top of the base OS image, which is running SLES. There are certain support boundaries that you kind of need to follow. Those are very well documented in the link that you can see here. One such example is that the host operating system OS that you have should be in sync with the base OS image that you choose to build your SQL Server container. For example, if you're building this on SLES 12 SP5, your host should also be running SLES 12 SP5. Now, this basically goes ahead and ensures that your host OS and the base OS images is the same. So these are certain certain pointers that you kind of need to build around when you're working for SQL Server containers. And I'm going to show you a demo right after this slide where I'm going to create a container image from the base OS image of SLES 12 SP5 and then host it on a SLES 12 SP5 machine. So this is something that I'm going to show you. And you can read more about the other options over in this link that you have. The next thing that I want to talk really about is all the security features. So your SQL Server engine, which is running on SQL Server containers, is basically the same SQL Server engine that runs on SQL on Windows or runs on SQL Server on Linux. So there's absolutely no difference between them. Your security features like Active Directory authentication, SSL encryption, transparent data encryption, your performance features like in-memory OLTP, column store indexes, all of that work with SQL Server containers that works with SQL Server on Linux or on Windows. And I'm going to show you how you can basically go ahead and enable Active Directory authentication for a SQL Server container which is running a SLES image. That's also the demo that I want to show and share the scripts with you. Last point that I want to really quickly talk to you about is a preview tool which is out there today for general public, which is called as the AD util. Now, without AD util, the problem of configuring Active Directory authentication for SQL Server on containers was that when you had to create users or when you had to interact with the Active Directory, you had to switch between a Linux machine to a Windows machine, create users, create SPNs, then come back to your Linux machine and create the key tabs. So to provide a seamless experience, we've come up with AD util, which is the tool that I'm going to show you and show a demo with, where using from your Linux machines, you can actually go ahead and interact with Windows Active Directory, create users, create SPNs, create the key tabs, and then use them, be it for SQL Server on SLES on VMs or bare metal, or also on SQL Server containers. So you could go ahead and do that. With that said, I think it's time for us to now get into the demo and spend about a few minutes there looking at all of this. Right, let's get started with the demo. So this is going to be a fast-paced demo. So, but do not worry, because all the demo that I'm going to show you here are linked in the additional information section in the PPT ahead. So you can always go ahead and try this again on your own. So let's get started with the demo. The first part of the demo that I'm actually going to go ahead and start is to build a custom container image. And to build a custom container image, the first thing that's basically required is, of course, the Docker file. So let's go ahead and take a look at the Docker file. And this, I'll just quickly take you through this Docker file. So what I'm going to do is I'll start with the base OS image, which is SLES12 SP5, then add a package called as libcap, which is basically to enable certain set of features like taking dumps and all of that. And then I'm going to go ahead and install SQL Server and also going to install SQL Server tools. And once I do the installation, I need to go ahead and give the right set of permission to the MS SQL user and group, because that's the user and group which SQL Server uses to run the SQL Server service itself. So that's the default group and user. And then I just go ahead and add certain set of privileges using the setcap, which is again optional, not necessary. And then I go ahead and also add the MS SQL config file, where basically you can provide all the configurations for the SQL Server. So this way, I'm basically going ahead and exposing port 1433, enabling certain configurations in SQL Server, and then starting the SQL Server as a non-root, which is very, very important. And that's why you see user MS SQL here. So if I have to build this image, all I've got to do is docker build. This is the command I basically need to run. I'm not going to run this because it takes a few seconds or probably about a minute or so to download the image and then build the layers on top of each of these images. So to save time, what I've done is let's just clear this. I have already created the image, and you can see I in fact not only created the local image, but I also pushed this local image to my Azure Container Registry, and the steps to do that is pretty much similar to what you would do when you want to push a local image to Docker Hub, right? So you basically log in and then you go ahead and Docker push. You first tag it and then you do a Docker push. So why did I push this to a container registry? Of course, so that I can go ahead and share it with my team members, and I could basically use it in AKS as well. So that's the reason why I went ahead and pushed it to the Azure Container Registry. So if you had to take a look at it, this is how it's going to look. So this is my Azure Container Registry. Inside the repo, I have this SLES SQL repo, and this is where the tag is available for me. So this way, I can basically use this on Helm. So this is a proper way of creating a supported package for SQL Server container image. Now let's go ahead and look at Helm and see how I can use this image, which I've just uploaded to the Azure container in Helm. So to do that, let's just clear everything. So let's just clear everything. I already have Helm installed on my machine, so all that is set. And now to do the installation, all I have to do is I run Helm install. And once I do this, so I just say install MS SQL is the name of my chart. And then I just go ahead and accept certain values or environment variables. And once I do that, this is going to go ahead and deploy the SQL Server. While the deployment is taking place, it's time for us to quickly take a look at the the values.yaml file. So let me just open the values.yaml file for you here. And as you can see here, what I'm going to do is, let me just zoom in. As you can see we are going to get 3 replicas. So using this Helm, what I'm basically going to do is install 3 different SQL Server instances, each instance using its own storage, which is a persistent storage. And then also each of these instances will be configured with an MS SQL config file that is also available. And I'm basically going ahead and using the image that I just uploaded or just I created on using the SLES image. So I'm just going to go ahead and do this. And as you can see, this is where I'm going to go ahead and create. So when I come back to the Helm and just clear this and just run your normal kubectl commands. And remember, I already have connected my AKS cluster to the Azure Container Registry, and integrating your Azure Container Registry with Azure Kubernetes Services, just a one-step command, which is AZ AKS update, the name of your cluster, the name of your resource group, and then you just give the name of your attach ACR and the name of your ACR. That's the set of commands. So you can see all the 3 containers are up and running. Now, to be able to access these containers, what I really need is the services. So for each pod, I'm going ahead and creating the service. So within few seconds, you should see, oh, I don't want to delete. You should see the services getting created. Wonderful. So here's an IP address that I already have. So I can just copy this, and your typical tool, I'm just going to disconnect, database engine, give the password. Don't worry. Yeah. So I'm just connecting to the SQL Server. And now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to say run this select at version. Let's just do a execute. And now when you look at the output here, you can see this is using my SLES image. Easy, isn't it? I was able to create a local image, share it across, run it on Helm, and was able to deploy 3 SQL Server instances in what, less than probably 5 minutes, and with just about 2 commands. One was Helm install and the other was kubectl create the services, and all of this created 3 SQL Server instances for me. So if I have to access the other 3, all I need to do is get their external IP addresses, so I can just use this and start accessing them. Great. So those were the 2 demos. The first one containing creating an image, the second one using that same image to basically go ahead and use it in Kubernetes environment. Now, the demo that I'm really excited to show you is using AD-util. Now, this is a demo where we are going to run a container on a host which is not connected to the domain, and still the SQL Server will be connected to the domain which is running on that same host as a container. Yeah, I know it's a lot of confusing, but let me just make it very simple. So this host, if I just do a realm list, is not part of any domain, right? And the container which I'm going to run inside this will be part of the domain, from where you can actually connect using an AD user. You can connect to the SQL Server. And how do we do it? We have a tool, AD-util, that I just discussed with you in the previous, when we were discussing it in the slides. And AD-util is the tool that I'm going to use. So what do I do with the AD-util tool? The first thing that I do with the AD-util tool, let me just zoom in so that it's easier. I first download the AD-util for SLES, and then you need to run the AD-util commands from a machine which is part of the domain, right? So this host is not part of the domain, so you connect to a domain or to a Linux machine which is part of the domain, Windows domain, and then run these AD-util commands after doing a kinit with a user that has enough privileges to create users in your Active Directory. So the first command that I do is create user, give the username, and what I do is when I provide the password here in plain text, but of course you can do it through environment variable or provide it interactively, keeping security in consideration. Then I create SPNs because I need to create the SPNs as fully qualified domain name and the port, host name and the port. and just the just the host without the port. So I need to do that. So the 4 SPNs gets created using one single command. And please remember, SQL SLES is the name of my container that I'm going to create. So when I'm going to run a Docker run, I have to give minus name is this name SQL SLES, and host name also as SQL SLES. And then I create the key tab. So SPNs created, user created. Now I need to join both user and SPNs and create that into a key tab. And that's what I do here. I just create a key tab, add entries for the SPN, and then add entries using the second command for the user. Again, all of these commands are documented, nothing that is not available. All of this is available for you in the additional info section. So with this done, your key tab is ready. All you've got to do now is copy this key tab from the host, which is part of the domain, to the host, which is not part of the domain. So let me just go back to my SLES. So what I've done here is to save time again, I've already copied the key tab file under the secrets folder. This is where it basically goes. So I've already copied the key tab file. And now what I can do is, let me just go back and show you the curb config file and MSSQL file that we have here. Curb config is a typical curb config file that you have. You basically create, provide the domain name. You don't create, but you just provide the domain name, and then you provide the host name, and you give the domain information. And in MSSQL config, you basically provide the user that you just created and where the key tab location is going to be inside the container. So once you have all of this ready, all you've got to do now is run your Docker run command. And as you can see here, I give the certain environment variables that are necessary. I go ahead and expose the 1433 on the host at 5433. And remember, the name and the host name has to be the same, SQL SLES, which is the one on which we created the SPNs. Then the persistent volume, I'm just mounting it so that curb config file, MSSQL config file gets mounted. And then you can see I am also going ahead and providing the DNS information to connect to my domain controller. So this is the IP address, this is the domain name, and then I also provide the mapping between each of them, so that because the host is not part of the domain here, so the container itself has to be able to do and identify and connect to the domain controller. So though that information is provided here. Once I provide this information and start my container, you should see the container is already started. And now if I have to connect to this using my Active Directory, let's do that. So the first thing that I basically do is I connect to my SQL Server. So how do I do that? I just go ahead and connect to my current SQL Server using SQL Server authentication first. Once I am connected, I just open a new query window, create that AD user. And once I create the AD user, I give the required permissions. All I've got to do now is just connect with your Active Directory account, and this should work. So you can see how easy it is. You did not have to switch to create the user or to manage your user. You did not have to switch to a Windows machine. Here in this demo, I basically showed you through SSMS, which is this, but you can also use Azure Data Studio, which works in Linux. So you really don't have to switch between machines to do this. So that is the seamless power that we would want to provide with AD-Util. And last but not the least, with the configuration of AD-Util with MSSQL config tool, these 4 or 5 or 6 steps basically will get reduced to about 2 commands to actually go ahead and enable the entire thing. With that said, let's go back to the slides.
Thanks, Amit. Super cool demo with Docker files, AD authentication, and the AD-Util. So yeah, that's really cool stuff. So we have a slide here to kind of talk about what's coming up, right? So this is stuff that's coming up soon. So the first one is SQL Server support for SLES 15, right? So currently the support is for SLES 12, and this will be added shortly. So this is going to be exciting for our latest version of SLES. The second one is documentation on how to set up availability groups with Stoneth, or shoot the other node in the head. So this is going to be actually pretty exciting, and to kind of set up like a more HA type scenario. And we'll go for the last one.
Yeah. The last one is the AD-Util GA, which is going to be very soon, which will integrate the MSSQL config tool with the AD-Util tool. So it'll make the life much more easier by just doing it in 2 commands. So this should probably come out very soon, probably by within the next quarter or so. With that, I think, James, you want to talk about this?
Yeah, so this is our kind of final slide here. We kind of included a bunch of references, some of the stuff we kind of talked about. And if you want to find out more information, you can hit up these links. So it's super useful stuff at the end here.
Yeah, awesome. That's it from us. Thank you so much for attending and spending your time with us, and looking forward to your questions. And if you have any questions about SQL Server and SLES, feel free to reach out to James and myself. James, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, SUSECON, for attending. Definitely check out all our other sessions. We have over 100 sessions, so check them out. Some really cool stuff here. And if you haven't seen the Microsoft keynote, definitely check that out as well.